All right, everybody. Well, welcome once again to Conversations in Health, Global to Local. This is, believe it or not, this is our fifth and final outside speaker, and we will finish with a terrific presentation and an opportunity to engage with our colleague Lily Ryan. So, a couple things. Why don't I do at the very end? I'll do a couple things about next week and about 2 weeks from now when we get together again, just as a class. But let me, just as a reminder to everyone, what we do, we invite someone who has had a distinguished career in health and will come and tell their story, and we will engage with them to find out about their career, their journey, and what they're working on. I would say that one of Lily's selection to join us tonight directly results from feedback that I got from two previous classes about the desire to have guests whose careers, who are earlier in their careers than, say, Dr. Collins, who we had last week. You know, who's so you followed Francis Collins.
Wow.
So he's had a longer career. He's had a longer career than, but I think you're going to find that Lily's career is incredibly rich for somebody who's as young as she is, and she is a fellow Hoya like the rest of us. So we'll hear more about that in a minute. So our format for tonight will be the same as it is each week. We'll start with each of you introducing yourselves. We'll get a sense of how many people are online. We'll spend about 30 minutes talking about your life and your background and some issues that are facing the country today. And then we'll turn it to start with the students who did the briefing emails. We'll open it up to the rest of the class, and if we have some time, we'll open it up also to our guests who are online. Lily, welcome back to Georgetown.
Thank you.
As we always do, I like to start at the beginning. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up, which I know is in New Orleans, but tell us a little bit more and a little bit about your family and how the whole journey started.
Yeah, and I feel like I should say off the bat, because I was told to say this off the bat, that everything I say is to do my views and not the views of my office or my employer. But yeah, not that they have anything to say about my childhood. But
sure, Senator Sanders, if he had a chance, I'm sure he would have a view.
So I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. Both my parents grew up there. Lots of connections to New Orleans. And I think maybe the parts that are relevant to the story and how I got to where I am is both of my parents are very political. They're both very Catholic, deeply religious, but deeply rooted in like the Catholic social justice tradition, and raised their children that way too, going to protests, knocking doors for elections, going to marches for peace, and so, I grew up rooted in all of that and kind of rooted in this, you should really be paying attention to what's going on and you should care about it because it has to do with you and it has to do with, your life is affected by everything that's going on and your life is also affecting other people. And so I definitely took that to heart at a young age, was very political myself from a young age, was reading newspapers and very interested in kind of what was going on. And so that kind of has stayed with me, I think, over the years and has kind of brought me to where I am.
So where did you go to school? I mean, did you go to, New Orleans is a complicated history of public and private education.
History.
So how did you go through?
Well, I think I should not claim the full valor of growing up in New Orleans. So my parents, though both being from New Orleans, we lived in Miami for the first couple of years of my life, and after Hurricane Katrina, moved back to New Orleans and had the opportunity to come back and be part of rebuilding the city. So I went to Catholic schools in New Orleans, partially because that was sort of my family's tradition, but also to your kind of suggestion that the school system in New Orleans is very broken. After Katrina, they actually privatized all of the public schools. Right. And so they are all charter schools, but all of varying degrees of quality. And my neighborhood schools were, not too great. And so I had a lot of privilege and a lot of that my family had the resources to send me to Catholic schools. And so I went to Catholic schools in New Orleans. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school. Our most famous alum is Amy Coney Barrett.
Wow.
So it says a lot about our school. But, I think that it was I think being rooted in the Catholic tradition, even the parts that I don't love, it definitely kind of, helped me grow in my own social consciousness and the way that I look at the world, I think.
And New Orleans, when you were, so aging myself, you were there when New Orleans was, you growing up through post-Katrina.
Right.
And I think I told you many years ago, I did work right in the immediate aftermath on housing, rebuilding affordable housing. But it was a very tough city. The politics were very complicated after the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'd be interested in, are there any memories from that experience that you now look back at as sort of shaping your life going forward? Because that was the political environment in New Orleans is very fraught.
Yeah, I mean, and it remains so. I mean, New Orleans
is permanently so.
Yeah,
perhaps,
it's a very complicated place. I think, so we were living in Miami. The Hurricane Katrina hits Miami first, and then it goes up to New Orleans. And I remember my parents watching the TV for hours and hours, just waiting to see how their entire extended families, the houses where they grew up, were about to be destroyed by a hurricane. And I think that it was apparent to me, I think it was 8, that when we looked at the people who were on TV, I remember watching, glued to the TV as to what happened post-Katrina, and the people who we were seeing didn't look like my family. Like the people who got left behind in New Orleans, who were living in the Superdome, the football stadium, and who were stuck at the convention center because they couldn't evacuate, didn't look like my family. They were black, they were brown, they were not people who were white and had means. And I felt really weird about that. I don't think I really understood why at 8, but I think that when you look at the post-Katrina reconstruction, that continued to happen, that the people who were included and who, had the money, had the means, had the insurance status to be able to put the roofs back on their homes, or one of my grandmothers, her whole home was destroyed, but she moved somewhere else, and it was devastating, but it wasn't the end of her livelihood and well-being, and for a lot of people that was not the case. And I think it's interesting when you probably 10 or 15 years after Katrina, it's been 20 years now, but you could still drive through certain neighborhoods that were primarily black and low income, and you would still see they did this thing where when they cleared the houses after Katrina, they would spray paint an X to show that somebody had gone by and looked around and see if anybody was in there. And you could still see that 15 years later. It was the houses had never been redone. They'd never been nobody was living there. And it was only it didn't look like that in the neighborhood where I grew up. It didn't look at that like that in the neighborhood where my parents grew up. It only looked like that in poorer areas and predominantly black areas. And it is still like that. It's there. I live the street where I grew up is here. There's a major street here, and then here it's a totally different world. There's two completely different socioeconomic, demographic, totally different racial demographics, and the ways in which those areas have city services are completely different. If our road is terrible, which it is, the city may pretend they're going to fix it. If the roads somewhere else are terrible, they're not going to pretend. They're just, nothing gets fixed, nothing gets done, and it's it's wrong. And I could go on about this for many hours about how broken New Orleans is, and it's sad because it's the best city in the world. If you haven't been, you should go. But it's also a reflection of deep inequality.
So I'm trying now. You eventually find your way here to Georgetown, but it does seem like the through line. We read a little bit about one of your interview you did while you were a student here, but the Catholic. I guess I'm really interested in at what point. Obviously, you grew up in a family that was, and you experienced Catholic education, but you obviously adopted some of the ideas from Catholic teaching. We've had other speakers, not this semester, but like Dr. Fauci talks about his experience in Catholic education and other. I guess at what point did that tradition, which seems to still animate your worldview, when did it become your own, as opposed to the world that you came out of?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I wonder. if it is my own now, I think that it's hard not to be influenced by. So, for full disclosure, my dad is a Catholic theology professor, and so that really affects you. And my mom works for a radical leftist Catholic nun, and so I think that it was always part of my life. The Catholic Church has always been part of my life, but I think that in high school in particular, going to a high school that I had a lot of personal problems with and disagreements with, and that my parents did too, thought was a little ridiculous in some ways. I think that seeing the problems of the Catholic Church, which are many, kind of helped me develop a sense of like what I wanted to take away from it and what I was fine leaving behind. I don't subscribe to all of the parts of the church. I really struggle with my relationship with it, but I think that thinking about the world in a way that celebrates the dignity of people, that celebrates the dignity of communities, that there's some great lines on Catholic social teaching that talk about solidarity, that talk about there's one phrase that always has stuck with me, the preferential option for the poor, that like people that God, when Jesus came to the earth, that he had a preference for people who were poor and uplifting them first. He was not friends with, the wealthy. He hung out with people who were, on the edges of society. And I think that has always spoken a lot to me. And then having a pope when I was a senior in high school, Pope Francis was elected, I guess. And he really spoke to that tradition, and then coming to a Jesuit school where that was a huge part of the mission of the school was really important to me. Like I think it sort of grounded a lot of the work that I did here, the work that I do, and the way that I look at the world. And there's a lot of reasons to feel a lot of despair, and I feel a lot of despair, but feeling like there is a purpose in what I am doing and what is happening makes a huge difference. It makes it a lot easier to kind of deal with the despair.
Well, one of the reasons I raised this is we talked at the beginning of the class about having a North Star as you navigate your career choices, and it doesn't have to be in a religion, and it certainly doesn't have to be in any particular religion, much less religion alone, but having some animating or organizing force is a way many people work through their career choices. So you came here, and then, so how did you decide on Georgetown? As much as we may hate to admit, there are other excellent Catholic institutions for higher education in this country.
Yeah, no, so I was actually born in South Bend, Indiana, when my dad was attending Notre Dame, and I would have been the fourth generation to go to Notre Dame had I chosen to go to Notre Dame. I didn't have a lot of interest in sort of the overwhelming Catholicism of another Catholic school. And, I was a political junkie in high school. Like, I loved the West Wing. I loved, being engaged in sort of,
Does everybody here know what the West Wing TV show is? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
This is the story of my life. I can make cultural references that no one knows.
I know, it's very of the late 90s, early 2000s, I guess. But I think I was very engaged in that, and so I that was part of the reason I came here. I had applied to schools that were not Catholic schools, and really thought about going further away to a different school, to different places. But I think that DC felt like a place that was I really like DC. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. There are direct flights to New Orleans. There's a lot going on. I love public transit and biking around, and so that was a big part of it. But I think that I was feeling very jaded, as a lot of high school seniors might be, of what is the point of all of this? Why am I going to college? Why this? What's going on? And I think there was an element of going to a school that had a mission that felt good. It felt like there was something there. I mean, I think again, like many high school seniors, I probably had an existential crisis and was I guess I'm going to Georgetown. But I think that was a big part of it. Just being in a city that I liked and at a school that had a mission that I believed in, I think made a lot of sense.
So you came here, and what did you major in?
I majored in government. I, like many Georgetown students, I came in interested in politics, and the government major, I assume it is still like this. It's right there. There's all those classes.
We don't have any government majors this year.
That is
that's very unusual.
Very unusual. I feel like everyone was a government major at some point in my friend group. But I will say that I was not necessarily the most studious student at Georgetown, and so I kind of it was the major that I had finished the most classes in by the time I was forced to declare a major. So then I was a government major. I think if I could go back, I might do something different, but.
So let's talk about what you did spend your time doing here. Do you want to say a little bit about your work with the Kalmanovitz Initiative and a lot of the organizing you did?
Yes.
Including protesting the university itself.
Mostly, yeah.
I will ask you about your occupying the president's office.
Yes, that's notorious. I would say that, again, maybe coming off the existential crisis of being in high school, questioning the world, I had this interest in social justice and politics, but it was introduced kind of through a mutual friend of a friend to kind of campus activism. Truly, like the second day I was here, he was a friend of my cousin's who was interested in activism, and I was like, great. And he's like, let me take you to the Kalmanovitz Initiative's fall open house. And they were talking, the Kalmanovitz Initiative is a floor down. They do labor policy, labor research, labor communications, labor organizing. And people were there and were talking about labor organizing. And there are very few unions in Louisiana. It's not a big union state. And I didn't really know anything about labor unions. But they were sort of speaking my language of this workers' rights and social justice. And I was like, that's really cool. And kind of turning me on to the idea that to be a student at a university, you're also part of this whole ecosystem. Georgetown University is one of the largest employers, if not the largest employer in the District of Columbia.
Private employer.
Private employer, not the federal government. Yeah, that would probably be number one. But it is a huge employer. It is one of the largest real estate holders, private real estate holders in the District of Columbia. And with that comes responsibilities. And it had never occurred to me that I could have a say in that, as to what a university or what any employer would do for their workers as a good steward of the resources they had. And so that sort of kicked off the main thing I feel like I did at Georgetown, which is spending a lot of time doing activism and organizing here. A whole variety of different campaigns with different workers, with different groups, both here at Georgetown and outside of Georgetown.
And did you so that was a big bulk of your time. And so tell us, I know you help represent groups that organize workers who work for Aramark, for even, did you work with organize any Georgetown employees?
Yes. Yeah. So we worked with sort of the Aramark workers my freshman year. This is maybe too much lore, so feel free to cut me off. But the workers in Leo's had already been organized into a union. But the workers in Hoya Court, where there's now a Chick-fil-A, but formerly was something else, and the Einstein Brothers, the hotel, were all also employed by the same contractor, but not in a union. So we did a lot of dramatic organizing with that unit of workers. We worked with facilities workers who were renegotiating a contract. The graduate student union, that was my junior and senior year, they were organizing. And then we worked with kind of coalitions of students from around the country who did what they called solidarity campaigns, which was, workers who made products that are branded. So your hat, the Georgetown hat, that is made. It is supposed to be made under certain labor conditions. So many universities, many of the largest universities in the country, have signed on to these labor accords that any university branded apparel has to be made under certain environmental, social, and labor conditions. And so we did a lot of campaigns to make sure that was happening with students from other universities.
So what led you to occupy the office of the president when President DeGioia was here?
It's hard to describe in short periods of time, but it was one of the campaigns about apparel. So whether the companies that were making Georgetown branded apparel or University of Texas branded apparel were following these labor standards. And we had received reports from kind of this national network we were part of that Nike, who makes a lot of college apparel, was not adhering to the labor accords, that there were some pretty serious labor abuses in a number of factories in their supply chain, and a couple that were like very newsworthy. And so the process for dealing with that is like extremely boring and like corporate jargon of like we're gonna do inspections, we're gonna call the lawyers. And I think that had happened, but it had taken years and years and sort of nothing had happened. And I think part of that is when you're a big company, you have your process, and when the meddling students at the meddling universities are like, you really need to be doing this other thing, that's hard for them. That's not what they want to be doing. And so it went on for several years. I sat on a committee at this university that I think sometimes met in this room, the Licensing Oversight Committee, which it sounds very boring and often was. But they oversaw the licensing contracts of things that said Georgetown. And for years through this committee, we kind of had this back and forth about what are we going to do about Nike? They're breaking the contract. They're refusing to do anything about it. People would be on the phone with Nike. It went on for years. And I think their contract with the university, both for athletic apparel and for apparel you could buy in the bookstore, expired in December of 2016. And so we had worked, again, with these national networks of students of like who also had contracts with Nike, who were like, what are we going to do? And I think it was determined that Georgetown was the best organized, our students were the best organized, and that the university was the least likely to arrest us compared to like the University of Texas or the University of Washington if we did something dramatic. So, which I think was accurate. We just, had a bunch of actions over the course of the year leading up to December, and nothing was changing. So we all sat down together, a bunch of students, of what are we going to do next? And so we occupied the President DeGioia's office, and for 36 hours we spent the night there. It was very cold, and to kind of make the point, but also put pressure on the university. And I think indirectly, Nike was aware this was happening. I think the university council at the time took film of us and sent it to Nike and said, look what the students are doing. Won't you please come to the table with us? And eventually we kind of got an agreement to make something happen. And I think about a year later, there was sort of a new accord with Nike to ensure that they would have good labor practices in their factories that made university branded apparel, which feels in some ways, it's so like circuitous to like, how do you get to that point where something good is actually happening? But
that's the complexity of social organizing.
That's the complexity of social organizing. And I could probably tell stories about the lead up to that sit-in and that sit-in for days, because a lot happened. If you are interested, there was a lot of student journalism about it, but it was dramatic, and I feel a lot of empathy for the administrators whose lives we made very difficult and who are ultimately very good people. But I think that there's a saying in organizing that direct action gets the goods. And it did. It did.
So you spent a good bit of your time as an undergrad here trying to change the university and the way it operates. You might not have been fully in love with your major, but you graduated.
I did.
And then what did you do after you graduated?
Yeah, so I when I was a senior at Georgetown, I was trying to figure out what it was that I was going to do next. And I had been steeped in the labor movement. I had been working for the KI. I worked for a labor union in DC. I had been doing all this stuff. And so I applied for a bunch of different jobs. And I think I kind of came down to three different things. So one was I had received a job offer to go organize adjunct faculty at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. I had gotten like a kind of internship at the AFL-CIO doing like Twitter. And then I had this opportunity to go do the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in San Jose, California. And I had no idea what I should do. I think I realized that organizing adjunct faculty in Duke, North Carolina was like, that was not, organizing a door-to-door, like telling people, hello, here I am, join a union, was not for me. It just was too much. And I think I wanted to leave DC. And so I doing the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, JVC, both of my parents did something very similar when they had graduated from college, like going and working, living in an intentional community, doing a service-oriented, real like Catholic but not too Catholic thing, was something that I had knew a lot of people who had done it. And so, it felt like the right thing to do, kind of just get out of, see like if I can, what it is that I really want to be doing. And so that is what I...
And that's a year, right?
1 year. I lived in a house with 6 other people. It was an old mortuary attached to a church in California, in San Jose, off the Santa Clara University campus. And I worked in a couple different roles, both at a high school doing sort of academic support and then at like a social services agency. And there were good things, there were bad things, there were trials, there were, great moments. But I think ultimately it was helpful for me to kind of think through what it was that I wanted to be doing, and also feel like, there is a phrase of like, too much, to people who have been given a lot, much is expected, or too much is, I'm going to butcher the phrase. To those who've been given a lot,
much is given, much is expected.
Thank you. I can't, it's in my mind, I can't articulate it, but it felt like I have an obligation as somebody who comes from a lot of privilege to be a part of like working towards something better. And so I felt like that was important for me to do.
So after the JVC, did you come back to DC?
I did. And so as much as I was like, I need to leave and do something different, the next thing I did was come back to Georgetown and work at the Kalmanovitz Initiative in labor policy research and organizing.
How long were you there?
I was there for almost 3 years. So I came back in fall of 2019 and was there for almost 3 years after that, and through the pandemic.
And that's when I met you, was during the pandemic, but you had already developed an interest in health. And so I guess maybe if you could say a few words, like where along the way did that interest, obviously there's lots of intersections with labor and organizing and social justice issues, but.
Yeah, and I've thought about this a decent amount myself, because I'm not 100% sure where it started, but I think maybe one of it is when, I was a nerdy high school student reading the newspaper, the thing that was happening at that point was the Affordable Care Act. Like the major policy issue of sort of my like teenagerness was like sort of the debates over the passage of and then the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And so I think like reading about that and kind of hearing from like my mom, who is a nurse and who has a degree in public health and worked in sort of like, public health nursing, and hearing from her about like what health insurance was like and like why she was like, yeah, like of course we should have this. It's crazy that like all of these problems with the healthcare system exist. And then kind of, as you get older, you go to college, you start encountering the healthcare system more and in a more conscious way. Like just the absolute like ridiculousness of the healthcare system, the brokenness of it, like became really clear, and the need for change and the need to do things about that like became really clear to me. And one internship I worked while I was at Georgetown one summer, I worked at a Catholic lobbying group that it was the summer of 2017 when they were really trying to overturn the ACA. And so everything we were doing was about the ACA. And so I really was just like, wow, like this is such cool work. And I thought that what the seed that was planted in my mind was I should become a medical doctor to do health policy. Like I should become a doctor and then I can be a great health policy advocate. And so for a while, and my junior and senior years at Georgetown, I took chemistry. And then after I graduated, I took all the other classes, the biology, the physics, the biochemistry, the organic chemistry, because I was like, I'm going to go to medical school. And so while I was working at KI...
So you were a pre-med, sort of.
Sort of, in a casual, not super organized way. But I did take all the pre-med classes because I thought, this is it. Like, I'm going to go to medical school. And then so when I had met you, I was in the process of, I think, taking organic chemistry.
Yep, I think that's right.
And thought that that's what would happen.
So then you then eventually decided not to go to medical school.
I did.
And to get your master's in public health, which I suspect is a question that several people in this room over the course of your career we'll have to think through. I'd love your thoughts on what, for you, what made, I remember these conversations, but maybe for everybody else to share what you're thinking about, why you chose the MPH route.
Yeah, and I mean, I struggled with it for a while, including after I went and got an MPH, and every now and then now, I think, there's the nice thing about medicine is it's always useful, and it's the kind of job that people always are going to need doctors, and it feels like it's a social good, and you can do a lot of good work as a doctor, and it's it felt very that makes a lot of sense. It felt very practical. But I think ultimately, I don't want to be insulting because I know some of y'all are biology majors. I just don't care that much about the function of the liver. I was I don't care. The cell pathways where it's the pumps and they're proton. I can't, I could do it and I could pass the tests and it was fine, but I just find it very boring. And I was realizing as I was starting to study for the MCAT, I was oh my God, I don't like this at all. I think this is not interesting. And again, no offense, I'm sure it's very interesting to some people, but I just was I don't think this is cool. But you could talk to me about health insurance and I was I love it. Talk about it all day. It was so, I just found it really interesting. And so I think that really the process of beginning to have to go back to all the material that I had learned in these classes to study for the MCAT, I took a practice test and I was oh my gosh, I never want to think about any of those things ever again. I don't want to think about proteins. And so then I was maybe I should get an MPH, do health policy instead.
Well, listening to the things that you're interested in is a good way to
I think so.
To make so you ended up leaving Georgetown finally.
Yeah.
And went to GW for get your MPH. That took a couple of years.
Yep.
And then what happened? Then did you end up? What was next?
Yeah. So, MPH, health policy, GW.
It's a great program.
It is, and I think it was. I have a lot of thoughts about master's programs. A large reason I went there was because it was the most affordable program for me, and that I think was very important to me, that not to go into debt for a degree that I wanted to use for professions that are not historically very lucrative. Public health is not where all the money is at. But so while I was at GW, the biggest thing that doing that degree did for me was giving me the freedom to just try a bunch of different things out. That when you work full time, it's you're that's what you do. You have to get ready for work, and then you go to work, and then you come home, and then you're starving, so you want to eat dinner. And it's you don't have time to just explore your interests or do a fun research project with someone. That just isn't part of the thing that you do. And so going to graduate school, it was suddenly I was in classes that were interesting and fun, but I also had time to do a research project with a professor and do another research project with a professor. I worked for a summer at Public Citizen, which is kind of a lefty, lobbying research advocacy organization, and I had time to do things like that and try them all out and kind of think. I also read a lot of books about public health and about health policy and about just things I was interested in, and I think it was nice to be able to do that, to go work a bunch of different jobs, and that gave me different insights into I kind of like this, I love this, and I think ultimately my final year, so my fall and spring semesters, I had applied to work on the Hill, on the HELP committee, and I did that mostly because I was that's what you do, you're in a policy graduate program, everyone was we're gonna go work on the Hill, and I never have been a person where I was Congress is my dream, and there are a lot of people like that, which is a valid dream to have, is to work in Congress, but I had never thought of I am that person. But I was you know what, let's shoot my shot. Given my background and my interests, my personal values, working on the HELP committee, working for Bernie Sanders, I was give it a try. And so I did that my final 2 semesters at GW, which was too much and don't recommend working full time and also being in school full time. But it all worked out and I have not left. So
how long have you been with the committee now?
So I started in the fall of 2023. 3, and so a little over 2 years, and a little over 1 year full time as like a real employee. So I graduated from GW in May of 2024, and so have been on full time since then.
So this is just to get everybody ready for when we'll transition. So let's see who's, and I've got, so maybe Sophia, we'll start with you, if that's okay. But hold on, I've got a couple more questions. So I'd like to, I guess, a couple questions. One is maybe one particular to what you do, and then I look a little bit of a check-in on where we are in the politics of the moment. But a little bit, when people say they worked on the Hill, if you haven't worked on the Hill, it's kind of hard to have a sense of what that is.
Yeah.
And we did share with you the job descriptions that CRS put together for the kinds of roles. But I guess a little bit of what you spend your day doing, and maybe even a little bit about why we ended up changing the class session, because you ran into a conflict with your office with the sort of things that you work on as a committee staffer.
Yeah, so, I can, if this is helpful to folks, if people have questions, talk about the different types of Hill roles. For my role, so I work on a committee that is, so I have on the minority staff now, so the Democratic staff of the HELP committee. HELP is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. I just do the H, just the health. And so we cover the issues in the jurisdiction of the HELP committee for healthcare are basically all healthcare, except for veterans healthcare, the VA, and Medicare and Medicaid, which is obviously very large. So we cover things like the FDA, CDC, NIH, SAMHSA, HRSA, ASPR, ASPE, general HHS things, and then sort of like general health policy that's not specific to Medicare, Medicaid, so like commercial insurance, for example, or like hospitals, hospital pricing. For me in particular, my role is a little bit of everything. So it definitely started out as a little bit of everything. When I was an intern, I worked a lot on just everything. When you're an intern, you work on whatever people tell you to work on. But I ended up working a lot on prescription drugs, both drug pricing, obviously a large priority of Senator Sanders, but also a lot on sort of the really arcane is not the right word, really weedsy, pharmacy benefit manager stuff, right, which is just so complicated. And so I did a lot of that. And so I've kind of continued doing a lot of really in the weeds, insurance, prescription drugs stuff. I cover as sort of the lead staffer on a couple of issues, like the hearing we had, which was on the 340B program, which is incredibly weedsy. And so do a decent amount of some of the senators' drug pricing, prescription drug work, and then kind of am a secondary staffer on most other issues, but particularly on health insurance and coverage and public health. So often, especially this year, we have a person whose full-time job is to do public health, but that is not enough when there's a million things happening in public health. And so I have become that staffer as well. And so we had a reconciliation bill that was all the implications were about health insurance coverage. The senator now also sits on a committee, the finance committee, that does Medicare, Medicaid, that sort of coverage. And so that at times this year, there was just far too much for our coverage staffer to take on all of that. So I was sort of the second staffer on that as well. So it's a little challenging to kind of be covering a bunch of different issues, but in a lot of ways for me, it's kind of ideal because I think it's all very interesting. It's all really important. And so it's kind of fun to be working on the things that are happening at any moment. This year, since January, it's been fun is not always the word I'd use to describe it, but it definitely, busy. And I think definitely intellectually, I feel like every day I just learn a lot because you have to kind of be learning about all of these different issues really quickly and trying to understand what you do. And I'm realizing I maybe didn't answer the question as to what I actually do.
No, but I think you've given us a little bit of it, so we can go in. But one last question about the shutdown, because healthcare is in the middle of it all. So any prognostication you want to share with us about where we're at?
I think we are at, it is today I think it became the longest shutdown ever. So it has been, I guess 35 days, 36 days. None of us are getting paid, which is a bummer. I think, though, I mean, and I will not try to be, I will try not to be too preachy, but, you know, I mean, this year and like what has happened to the public health and the healthcare infrastructure of this country, I mean, it is fundamentally different today than it was in January. Like the country, the way that healthcare is delivered and the way that we do public health is different. It is completely changed, I would say, and it is my firm belief that it has changed for the worse. You know, in February, we fired a bunch of people, public servants at CDC, at NIH, at FDA. In April, we did it again. In June, or I guess in June in the House, in July in the Senate, we passed a bill that will kick 10 million people off of their health insurance. There's been rulemaking that will kick him another million off. With the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credits, will kick another 4.2 million off. So 15 million people are going to lose their health care, you know, in the next couple of years because of what has happened. And I think those are the people who will lose their health care. All of your health care, whether or not you're paying for it, including my healthcare, my employer-sponsored healthcare, will be more expensive because of what has happened this year. People who buy their healthcare on an individual exchange, their healthcare will be more expensive. Hospitals who rely on Medicaid funds are really struggling. And so I think that like that is the backdrop in which we go into the shutdown. That how do we act as if everything is normal and just agree to a spending bill that was forced upon us by the Republicans in the House when we're in this climate where we've completely thrown out like what is normal and what is acceptable in terms of healthcare. And I think this is maybe not the main thing that we're talking about, that our office or our party is talking about in terms of the shutdown, but you know, Congress in the Constitution was given the power to spend money, the power of the purse. And when you appropriate money, the expectation is that the executive will spend it, and particularly in global health, which is, and I think that's where it's kind of the most tragic, is we've appropriated billions of dollars to help the most vulnerable people in the world and protect them from infectious diseases. And the president has largely just said, no, like, just no, like, just not going to spend that money. And I think that when you think about a spending bill, which is, you know, sort of a normal procedural thing you do in Congress, is how do you continue to strike spending deals if the other party can simply just ignore them later on? And I think that is the backdrop for the shutdown, is like, how do you, in good faith, negotiate when everything has been thrown out and when all of the norms have been thrown out? And I think that is what is underlying the fight of the moment, the shutdown of the moment. I am fine. Like, I don't like not being paid for my labor, but like, you know, I will be okay. But a lot of people won't. And so it's not an easy decision to shut down the government. It is, I mean, it's excruciating in some ways, knowing that like the lowest paid workers who might work in the Senate, who are the janitors, the cafeteria staff, like they're not getting paid either. And it is just like, it's like viscerally wrong to feel that like these people are coming to work every day and are like not getting paid and may not have a social safety, like not the social safety net, the financial safety net that I have. And it's horrible. I hate that is happening. But at the same time, it's like, oh my gosh, like, can we totally give up on fighting for like people for the next 10 years, for people's healthcare, for people's ability to like take care of themselves when they get sick, and also, you know, trust that when we make a deal that it's going to stay in place. And so, you know, prognostication wise, I mean, I feel like I don't necessarily have more information than anyone else does. We read the same like gossip and Politico and like what are people saying. You know, I think I try not to be too partisan, but I am very partisan. I think that our feeling is that our friends on the other side of the aisle control the White House, the Senate, and the House, and I hope that they come to the table soon.
Fair enough. Well, let's open it up. So, Sophia, will you start us off, I think?
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I know you mentioned just now that like the law has changed in public health even between January and now. And I was wondering, kind of, given all that change, like how has your perspective on the policy making process, and I guess just healthcare politics in general, kind of evolved, like between when you started working on the Hill, or even when you were doing student organizing at Georgetown? How has your perspective on policymaking changed?
Yeah, and I may answer the end of that question first. I think when I was doing organizing work here, I had a lot of skepticism of policymaking in general. That if you had told me when I was 19 or 20 that I would be working in Congress, I'd be like, no, what a sellout, and buying into the the institutions. And I think in some ways maybe I still feel that way, because being in Congress and seeing what is happening, it is unbelievable how frustrating it is. And I think but I don't think that I feel differently in the sense of from last year to this year in terms of what it needs to be done and what is being done. I mean, I thought when I entered Congress, when we were in the majority and we had all the power, which it is a lot easier to get things done when you're in the majority, it was still clear that Congress is just a fundamentally broken institution, and that the pace at which change happens is glacial. I mean, it is so slow. And so it's unbelievably frustrating to be there, and then to see, an executive right now that is moving so quickly to try to just trample on institutional norms and the way that our systems operate. And you want Congress to be sort of the stop of that, to be okay, we are the real check on this branch of government. And because it is so slow and so broken and everything happens at such a glacial pace, it's not doing that. And so that's frustrating. And so it makes you feel it could make me feel very down on the policymaking process, and maybe I am. But I also think there's sort of a tendency, I think particularly on the left, but maybe in general, to be burn it all down, whatever, don't even either don't engage with it, or just we're gonna burn it down. And my feeling is maybe we would be better if there was a system that was completely different. But this is the system that we have, and people are here right now. And if the work we can do in policymaking will make people's lives better, even if it's not in the way we hope it would happen, we want Medicare for all, but will we fight for pharmaceutical benefit manager transparency reform? You bet we will. Because if it will make people's lives better, even a little bit, we should try to do it. And in this moment when we're facing all of these threats to public health, to healthcare coverage, it feels so frustrating to be sending letters and trying really hard at hearings to ask difficult questions, and it feels often very fruitless, but boy, we better try, because I don't know what the alternative is at this point.
Shahan?
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. My question kind of expands on this discussion about Congress and the policymaking process.
That's great.
So Senator Sanders is nationally renowned for his bold reforms. A recent example being the proposed Healthcare Workforce Expansion Act. Given this, how do you strike a balance in your policymaking approach between smaller reform and more larger revolutionary reform, especially in the context of this administration and a Republican majority Senate?
Yeah, I think, I feel like I am referencing someone, and I'm not sure who it is, about always working towards creating the world you want to live in. Always work to build the world you want to live in, even if it means that along the way you have to make really small buildings that are terrible. But I think that, look, Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, he's not quiet about what he thinks should happen in the healthcare system. We introduced this year, and I think it was the 4th or 5th time that we introduced Medicare for all. And I really believe in that. I think healthcare is a human right. I think everyone should have healthcare. But I don't think that any of us are naive to where we are in this moment. It's not passed. We don't have the votes for Medicare for all, and so I think that you could kind of, maybe similar to kind of the previous question, you could either sort of disengage and be well, it's either Medicare for all or nothing, and if you propose any other bill, we're just going to ignore it because it's not Medicare for all. But I think that Senator Sanders, and I think for myself, I know that's not how we can operate. And even with the bill you mentioned, the workforce bill, we want that to pass. Like, we want there to be affordable nursing school tuition, affordable medical school tuition, or free for people who are going to practice in socially desirable, specialties, go practice primary care in a rural area. Like, I want that person to have free medical school. Do I know that bill is going to pass? I don't know. But if it helps people envision the world in which we're trying to move towards, I think that's really important. And maybe it puts the idea in a more moderate senator's, head that, like, hey, maybe we need more, loan repayment programs at HRSA, and like, we're all for it. If it gets us moving towards what we ultimately want, which is, every man, woman, and child in this country having the healthcare coverage they deserve and need, then I think it's a worthy venture.
Neela?
So I know you touched on, you said that you have a strong emphasis on social justice and that bring awareness to equality. I was just curious on how do social determinants of health influence the way you think about strengthening the healthcare system and improving insurance coverage and your policy recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I think in every policy, we should always be thinking about who is this helping, who is this not helping, who should this be helping. I think that, we can work really hard on reforms of commercial insurance for people who get their healthcare coverage from their employers. But, that's helpful for people who have a job that offers healthcare. And so we should always, if we're working on that project, we should be thinking about who's left out of this. Like, that's people who are on Medicaid, who are on Medicare, who, don't get insurance through their jobs, and so they're getting insurance through an exchange. They're having to pay for it out of pocket. And so every reform should be thinking about, who is included, who is left out. I think it's no secret, and I'm sure you've talked about it at length in this class, that Black and brown people in this country are impacted most by, health inequities, by environmental health problems, by, the brokenness of our healthcare system. And I think that instead of sort of pretending that that's not a problem, we don't want to collect data on it, we don't want to find out more, we should be really eager and hungry to think about, why is that? And, how can we be designing policies that get at that first? And I think, not to, be a nerd sort of here too, but I think the idea, and for me, the idea of the preferential option for the poor is, right up in there, from Catholic social teaching, that, we should be looking at things that help the poor, that help the marginalized, that help people who are left out first. And then we can worry about everything else. That, from my personal values, that is how policymaking should work. It should always have a preference for uplifting those who are worse off first, and then we can worry about everyone else. Not that we should not worry about everyone else. We should. Everyone should be helped, but that's how I feel like we should prioritize the work we're doing.
Natalie?
Sort of had two closely related questions. So we've read one of your reports on Sanders. I think it's one of the reports you wrote on how many people will lose health insurance. So people in Congress know about this, but they're sort of overlooking it. So in an age where you can just dismiss evidence, is it still meaningful to keep looking for more evidence, or should you adopt more louder methods of protesting, like rallying? And at the same time, should experts engage themselves in politics to get their research noticed, but at the same time, would that risk them losing credibility for joining a side?
Yeah, a couple different things. I mean, so I think kind of a couple different questions and topics. So, I mean, I think one of the most powerful tools of authoritarianism is a rejection of the truth, a rejection of science, a rejection of facts. And I think that is part of what we're seeing now. And the report you reference talks about people who will lose their healthcare coverage, hospitals that will close. And in a lot of ways, when you listen to people talk about the reconciliation bill, talk about the shutdown, talk about the cuts to healthcare that have happened this year, there's a lot of people just like don't want to talk about it, want to pretend it's not happening. Oh no, it's not those people, it's not the hospitals, it's not the nursing homes, that's not where we made the cuts. It's only for the people who are unworthy of healthcare. There's this set of people who we've deemed they don't deserve it because they're not working hard enough, they're not doing this. But we know from empirical fact that that's just not true. When you cut healthcare, you cut healthcare. Like people lose their healthcare. Like hospitals, doctors, they get less reimbursement for their services. Like people lose their healthcare. And so I think it is important to always just keep saying facts, keep saying the truth. And if, I think a lot of people who don't want to face that truth, they know that they're wrong. Like they know what is true. And I think it's our responsibility to continue to get it out there. I think there's kind of this other thing happening in healthcare that's, sort of the rejection of science, which is a little bit different. And I think that experts, I think, we've talked to a lot of people over the last year who are, vaccine scientists, infectious disease scientists. And I think for most of their careers, they have been kind of doing what you referenced, like they do a study on like whatever vaccine and they publish it in JAMA, and then other scientists read it and they're like, great study, like here's the evidence. And all of a sudden we're now in a place where like the accepted science is like no longer in, like accepted science on vaccines, accepted science on autism, on whatever, you name it. And so I think a lot of experts, kind of like you mentioned, are in this place where it's like, do I have to become an activist now? Do I have to go protest? Do I have to now call my senator every day and tell him that no, vaccines really are safe and effective? And I don't know, like if I was in that position, I think there is always the risk that if you start speaking out now, well, you're no longer a scientist, now you're actually just like sort of a party politician, you're an academic who's just gone off the rails. But I think that like, I don't know what choice we have. Like science, I think that people have to fight for it because otherwise we just won't get it anymore. We just won't have accepted truth. And so it's tricky because I sympathize with folks who want to remain sort of neutral, but I think that when people take truth and politicize it, it's not doing anything is no longer neutral. Like you've chosen a side, and the side you've chosen is against the truth.
So I'm going to open it up. So I think I've typically gone left to right. So tonight we'll go right to left. Ashley, Muller, and Ella. Why don't you guys start us off?
So are you familiar with what a rosebud thorn reflection is?
Yes, I am. I mean, I went to Georgetown. We do a lot of that here.
So during your time working as a health policy advisor for the health committee, what has been your rosebud and thorn working on the Hill?
Man, that's tricky. I think this. I mean, I'll choose just things that come to my mind immediately. So, for the rose, when I was still an intern, I was still in graduate school, I made this graph that was like visualizing the increase in launch prices in prescription drugs over the last 25 years. And it was a box plot. And so I had to explain indirectly to Senator Sanders what a box plot was, which was fun. And he, at a hearing, he like put it up behind him and he was like, look at that. And he was like kind of talking about my box plot. And it just was really, I had not yet been hired. I feel like I've done a lot of cooler stuff since then, but I feel like at that moment I was like, wow, like Senator Sanders, somebody who had like been my political hero since I was in high school, I was like, oh my gosh, he's talking about my box plot. So that's a little nerdy. My thorn is most of the last 10 months, but I would say like working really, really hard to try to poke holes in the Republican reconciliation bill. There's a whole arcane process where you like go and you argue in front of the Senate parliamentarian, and I got to do that, which was very cool. But then we lost on like everything, and the bill was worse than we thought it would be. Like more people will lose their insurance than we ever thought possible, and it just to like work really, really, really hard against something and then it just happens anyway is like feels really bad. But I mean, this is sort of general, but I feel like I have never learned so much as I do when I'm at work. Like it is so frequent that like I come in and somebody's like, write me something on this topic you've never heard of before. And it's like, oh my gosh, but like, it's such a fun way to and also really scary, but like a really fun way to just like learn really quickly. And I like to learn. So kind of just always hoping to learn more.
Muller?
Hi, this is kind of building off of your answer to Ashley's question just now. But I think like recently I've also been sensing like despair about like the current situation, but I think you've expressed this like notion of sort of working towards this positive change despite fruition or reciprocation. So what gives you hope to kind of stay committed in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question because sometimes I'm like, nothing, but that's not true. I think a couple things. So one, and this is not to say that like if you feel despair, or you feel sadness, or you feel whatever grief about what is happening, that's like wrong or invalid, or you should tell yourself like, no, don't do that. I think it's natural, but despair is a useless emotion, and it doesn't, like being sad or feeling grief, like that's a thing. But feeling despair, I've had to kind of tell myself, it's like, what is that doing? It's just like wallowing sort of in what's happening. And so I try to look towards what I want to happen, and also think about the fact that people have felt unbelievable amounts of despair about the situations they've been in this country for every year of its existence, and people fought every day to try to make it better, and like it's really hard to do that, but knowing that other people have done that before me and like continued to like get up and do it gives me a lot of solace, I guess. And I think that like, you know, sometimes like your message, like what we'll say or our message just, it breaks through, and that gives me a lot of hope. I think looking at, I live in Virginia, and like being able to vote in an election and not feel deeply despairing about the results, like felt really good last night, and like trying to like bring those hopeful moments into my mind more than despair has been what I've been trying to do, but it's hard.
Well, Ella?
Thanks for all your responses. So 15 million people, like you said, are losing their health care, and you know, a lot of these people are Trump supporters. We live in a country where a lot of people are Trump supporters, a lot of people are not. A lot of them are bound to be Trump supporters. So how do you think the Republicans and Democrats should respond to the future requests for support of these people? And what do you think actually will be done to support these people as their outreach kind of like cultivates the moral center?
So for the first part, what should we do when people who perhaps voted against their own interests are struggling, is I think we should help them. I think that like I feel like I've seen a lot of, and I know a lot of people who feel sort of like, you know, too bad, like you voted for this, and I think people get sort of the like schadenfreude of like, wow, like it, you know, getting pleasure from other people's pain, and I think that brings us to a really dark place if we can only care about the material needs of the people who are alike, who we can relate to. Like, I can relate to this person who I know personally, and so like they deserve it. Like it's kind of perpetuating the same, like, I think really harmful myth that there's certain people who are deserving of services and healthcare and food stamps or whatever, and certain people who are not. And so I think like, yeah, when people get mad, like, I think it's fine to be like, we tried to tell you, but we should still help people. Like that's the right thing to do. In terms of what will happen, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that what I feel like we're doing in our office is trying every day to like I don't know if call back is the right word, but like reverse the harm that is happening and try, I don't think it's ever too late to say, you know what, we're just not going to do that thing that we said we were going to do. There is never too late to say Medicaid work requirements, bad idea. Like at any point in time, I think Democrats should be willing to say, you know what, if you're willing to like reverse course on that, like let's do it. Let's work together to like make that not happen, that bad thing not happen. And I hope that, I don't feel necessarily deeply confident, but, I think that it's never too late to admit you're wrong. And I think that, like, if that happens, like, we should work together to bring things back around.
I would just add that sometimes you don't even need people to admit that they were wrong,
Sure.
as long as they're prepared to move ahead
Yeah.
on improving the situation.
That's a great
just
point.
a thought.
I think that's a good point.
So we got the right side. I'm now moving to the left side. So let's see. I got Layla and Sophia and Ganit. Okay. So how about, all right, I did in the wrong order. So how about, Layla, why don't we start with you and then we'll go.
Yeah, I first just want to say, in Justice and Peace Studies classes now, they teach about the action that was taken to change the Nike contract. So it's very exciting that you're here. I would love to hear more about your perspective on direct action, especially because you mentioned like realizing organizing maybe wasn't for you.
Yeah.
And thinking about like direct action and activism versus policy and being in government, and especially looking back on your time in organizing, and thinking now about like, okay, how do we create the most positive change, and even how those two interact.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think that organizing doesn't have to be a full-time career. And so for me, I felt like organizing was not my full-time career path. Like I didn't see it as like the thing I wanted to do forever. But I think we should all be organizing all the time in our personal lives, in our communities. And that might mean like if you've ever been to what is usually a very annoying training where they teach you about like how to do organizing, there's often a situation where you have to like role play, like maybe you've done this, but and you'll be like, you're trying to change someone's mind, and that can be organizing too, like organizing somebody to like follow your perspectives, to like do an action. That action may be like getting them to go vote. And so I feel like I try to have those conversations in my personal life a lot of like trying to change people's minds, trying to invite people to take an action with me. And so I think I still do that, and I think we should all do that, especially in this moment. I think in terms of like where it fits from with like policymaking is, I certainly when I was really deep in the organizing world, like did not believe that like our salvation comes from electoral politics. And I would say as somebody who is working in politics, I continue to believe that like democracy is something that happens at the ballot box, but it also is something that happens in the workplace. It happens in our communities. And so it shouldn't be the case that like you go like, so I went and I voted yesterday in my election, and then I get to say, you know what, that's it. I'm gonna be unengaged with anything, electoral or otherwise, for the next like whatever the next election is, 1 year. I guess it's next year. And so I think that it's always a both and with like organizing outside of politics and organizing in politics. And I think that they should be connected. And I think one of the things I appreciate about working in the office that I work in is that like, even though I don't do it personally, a lot of like labor union work, like the senator meets with labor unions like every week. He meets with somebody who's organizing, a campaign, and we meet with a lot of community groups. We meet with people who are doing like healthcare work, who are doing grassroots healthcare work. And like, I think that's important because like, ultimately that's what people see for the most part. Most people don't come to Washington and meet with their senators. Like most people engage with social change and with politics and with policy at a hyper-local level. And so organizing should always be a part of the policy-making process. It's just, how you engage in it, how I engage in it looks different than it may have 10 years ago, but I think it's all still connected. I don't know if that answers your question.
Guinea?
Thank you so much for your time. So this question is kind of related to the report about like what healthcare providers think about Republican cuts to healthcare.
But in your opinion, like in an already kind of broken system, how would you suggest how healthcare workers could like support patients and work with insurance policies to kind of optimize the best possible outcome?
It's a really good question, and we talk to a lot of providers and clinics all the time, and I find that to be a real privilege to hear from people who are thinking all the time about like, I have this patient, they don't have insurance, like what do I do? And people like the hoops and the knots that doctors will tie themselves in to try to help people is really both tragic and really amazing that people are willing to do this. I think like, there is nothing more powerful, there's like no more powerful image, to me at least, I'm biased, than somebody in a white coat getting up and saying, my patients need this, and like being willing to say that to Congress, to policymakers, to governors. Like it is, I cannot overstate like how impactful it is. People with like the real world lived expertise of saying like, would my patient who didn't have insurance skipped their diabetes medication and then they like went into DKA, that's really powerful. Like that really tells the story. And so I think that's one thing, is that like, I think clinicians can always be really powerful advocates for like telling the story of what a cut or what a policy means. I think on the other end, I think, and this is partially from my experience organizing with physicians, that I think a lot of physicians in particular, but I think, across the healthcare spectrum, folks don't necessarily see themselves as workers in the same way that workers who are in sectors that have like really strong traditions of labor unionism do, that I can work to make the conditions of both my job and for the people my job affects better. But I think that when doctors organize, when nurses organize, they organize not only for themselves and their own conditions, but often they're organizing for, nurses in particular, are organizing for better staffing levels. So it's something that's better for patients. When doctors organize, they've often organized for resident physicians will often organize around better working hours, so that they're not doing a surgery after being awake for 80 hours, which is very bad. And so I think that when folks organize either formally in a union or just come together and say, what is it that we want out of a healthcare system? I think that's very powerful, that we can point out what the problems are with our system and really think together what does change look like. Just of something I was thinking about today, there's this practice of private equity, so large financial corporations buying up physicians' practices and then sort of, kind of race to the bottom, lowering staffing levels. And there's a group of emergency room physicians who are just what if we didn't do that? And they're just no. And they actually sued this private equity-owned emergency room staffing company in California, and they got them to leave the state. And that's just not a thing anymore in California, this company that did private equity staffing of emergency rooms. And so I think that clinicians can be creative, and when they come together and use their voice, I think it's very powerful in a way that often folks underestimate.
Well, we've got at least one nurse to be, and I suspect several doctors in this room. So I totally agree. I think it's a powerful, underappreciated voice. Sophia?
Yeah, so I'm also interested in your background in organizing. I was at full day training last weekend, so I think it's funny that you brought that up. But I'm wondering what your advices are. We face so much university pushback right now, and it's literally on the livelihood of people in our community. What is your advice for organizing on campus? Can you speak more about what you did? And then especially with coalition building and how it worked on, but also with off-campus communities, and how you got your wins.
Yeah, a lot of good questions there. I think, I know I have heard through the grapevine and somewhat directly about there being things with the Guts Bus drivers. I know there's other things going on. There's always things happening on campus. I think it's difficult. Here I am at Georgetown University, the guest of Georgetown, and I don't want to be too critical.
You should. We still have academic freedom, so you should feel free to say it.
I think, look, universities are businesses, and I think Georgetown is probably one of the most mission driven and like actually has values universities in this country. And I really mean that. I'm not trying to like, you know, pump up Georgetown. Like Georgetown really does have values, and like I think that it is important to remind Georgetown of those values. And you know, I think that the dual identity of a business and a mission-driven university sometimes come, you know, they headbutt against each other, and sometimes the business, the financial side of it feels like it's kind of winning. So it's, you know, you gotta kind of move the other side along. And so that means like reminding the university and its administration of its values and what do those values mean. And that might, you know, I am happy to, at any point, if this is something you want to follow up on, regale you with any of the ridiculous things we did when we were students. But that might mean, you know, doing an action that involves the Jesuits who are on campus. It might mean delivering a petition that really incorporates language from the mission statement of the university. It might mean, you know, incorporating outside stakeholders who care about Catholic and Jesuit education into your campaigns. I think that like it is worth, though, always grounding your organizing in the people who you are working with. So if you haven't had a conversation with the workers who you may be talking to, or if you're doing environmental work, like if you haven't thought about who is being impacted by it, it's always helpful to kind of ground yourself in this, like, what do those folks actually need? And I also think that a lot of, it's easy when you're a student, and when I was a student, to look at the folks who are in charge of Georgetown or any institution and be like, why don't they just do different? And I think that like as I progressed through my time at Georgetown, I would have conversations with those folks who I was like, why aren't they just doing better? And realized that often they agreed with me, and there was some other force that was sort of holding them back from doing what I wanted them to do. And so I think it's good to have conversations with those people and figure out, what is it? Is it a board of directors who has some sort of financial goal that does not match with like whatever goal you have? It may be. And so how is it that we can liberate them from that pressure? How can we help people who usually want to do the right thing? What is it that is holding them back from doing the right thing? And how can we relieve that sounds like violent, but relieve them of that burden. I mean it more in like how can we like convince them that's not a problem? How can we work around that problem, whatever it is? Like, how can we take away what is holding people who usually really want to do the right thing? How can we make it easier for them? And I think having some of those conversations like made it really helpful to me to like proceed like that. And then in terms of outside stakeholders, I mean, I think there's no reason to duplicate the effort that other people are doing. Students all over this country are doing actions in support of academic freedom, against fascism, pro, you know, whatever cause you're interested in, doing labor work, doing environmental work, doing, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so talk to those folks. Like, they've done things, and like some people, like, boy, they really crashed and burned and did a really bad job. And so that's a great thing to learn from. Some people were like super successful, and like maybe it didn't even take that much effort. And so like it's good to be connected with folks and figure out like, how do you learn? And I would say the same thing at Georgetown. There, you know, when I was here, people had been organizing with campus workers for over 20 years and had been doing some of the same, meeting in the same room in White Gravener we'd been meeting at 9 p.m. on Mondays for over 20 years. And so we would talk to those people who had been doing it for 20 years and like, what did you do when you were here in 2004? And like, you can learn a lot from that. Like, it was really interesting. Like, boy, people had the same problems, the same things every 4 years. Like, a new group of students comes in and is like encountering the same things. And so, I don't know, there's always opportunities for that as well.
I think we might try to go online. Do we have some questions, John?
So we have several questions online. I'll ask the first one and see if
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, we got a couple more.
So this question is from Joy. A Democratic Socialist was elected mayor of New York City last night. How, if at all, do you see these progressive ideas influencing policy discussions nationwide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's cool to see, like, in New York City, like there's somebody who's young, who's exciting, who's talking about like what people see as the real problems that they're facing in their lives and their communities. Like he's talking to what really concerns people, which in New York is affordability. I can't afford my housing. It's expensive to buy food. And I think what I would hope, and you know, I don't do electoral politics. I, you know, work in Congress and don't work on campaigns. And so like, how will this impact campaigns? I have no idea. But what I hope people think about from it is that, you know, I have a 25-year-old cousin who lives in New York who, like, you know, has always been interested in politics. But boy, when Mamdani, like, you know, got the nomination, it was like he was on the streets canvassing, and it was because he was talking about issues that he, like, that my cousin, like, really felt like spoke to him. And I think a lot of people feel like politicians don't talk to them, don't know what the issues that they're facing are. And I think my boss talks about this a lot, that, like, people are worried about their livelihoods, about being able to afford rent next month. And like, when you have politicians who talk about that, people feel really heard. And so I hope that like people will take note of that I think a lot of people felt really heard by Mamdani, just, you know, regardless of whether he's a democratic socialist or whatever. I think people felt like he was speaking to them and speaking their own language. And I think that's really important.
We probably have time for another one, unless there's a, wait, what?
Yeah.
Oh, did I miss? I'm sorry. I didn't.
No, it's okay. Thank you again for coming and being with us today. Earlier during this year, I think it was like in May, a lot of recent graduates were afraid that they weren't going to be able to do anything productive with their recent public health degrees and things like that. So my question was just about, with federal health programs being cut back, how do you see this affecting opportunities for those recent public health graduates who still want to make a meaningful impact in their communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish I had a really good answer, and I don't know that I do. I mean, I think that like it is like one of the things that occasionally brings me to despair is thinking about how, like, gosh, isn't public health just like the most important thing? Like we just had a pandemic, and like it feels like this is the most important thing, like making sure people are healthy. And people who go into public health are not going to public health because they're like, I will now be a millionaire. Like that, people go into it because they care and they think it's important. And so then seeing not only federal opportunities disappear, but also, you know, the CDC funds, you know, huge amounts of programs at local, state and local health departments. And so seeing those opportunities go away is just like, oh my gosh, what are we doing with this generation of folks who have gone into public health because they want to do good in the world? And so I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that like there are a lot of states, cities, health departments who know how important this work is and are hoping that in 3 years, there will be a reinstitution of a lot of CDC like health programs that like this administration will realize how important this work is and will reinstate some of this funding. And so I think a lot of, you know, organizations, states, local health departments are trying to like keep people on and continue to hire folks so we don't lose this generation of people. But it's hard, and I have a lot of friends who, you know, got their first job with HHS and then lost it in February and have just been like, what do I do now? And I mean, I think it's like this is such an unprofessional way to say this, but like such a self-own for our country to just be like, we have this great group of really smart people and we're just like not going to engage them in like what is incredibly important work. And so I don't know what the answer is. And I think that some, you know, nonprofits, private organizations have been trying to fill that gap. And so I hope that folks are able to find positions that are here in the interim, but I think what is really needed is we need to fund public health. And so I hope that this administration and future administrations will recognize that and fund the positions that are really important.
Let's see, anybody, any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss one over here again? Did anybody? One more, please.
So this question is from...
This will be our final question.
So in the past 10 months, how have you practiced self-care in order to prevent burnout?
That's a great question. Yes, it is necessary. I think that I have tried to do a couple of things, and I haven't always done a great job of this. One thing I try to do is I try not to read the news on non-work devices. So this sounds really weird, but like it is my job to know what's going on like in the world. Like, and so when I get to work, I might read the news, like read the morning news. And I, you know, sometimes like I have to go home with work and I work on my work laptop or I have my work phone if I have to look up what's going on. But I try not to just like like what I used to do is I used to like wake up and eat my breakfast while reading like the morning news. And it is like bad. And so I just am like, I cannot do that. So now reading the news is part of my job. Like it is my job to stay informed. I think it's important that we all be informed. People should read the news. Like I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. But I try not to be like, okay, I'm just gonna like, I'm on the metro, like I'm gonna like see what's happening on Twitter and like read that news or like read the news on like in the New York Times like while I'm transiting or at home or eating a meal, because it just is bad. And it is like my job and I just don't want to do more of that unnecessarily. And then I think I've tried to also just separate, like recognizing that there are things within my control, but those are fairly limited. What is in my control is like fairly small, and what is out of my control is like most things. And so trying to recognize that and like when it is becoming difficult to like feel like I cannot control millions of people losing their health insurance, to just, you have to step away at some point. And then I think continuing to do the things that I like doing. Like I play on a really bad soccer team and like that I play like recreational soccer and we're terrible, but it's really fun and I like going and I love watching the Washington Spirit play soccer, and like I try to go to every game. Like I try to like make sure I have things on my schedule like with friends that I'm just gonna do. And I think that like that is something that's in my control, and like so much is out of it. And so doing the things that I like within my control, I think is what I can do and what I try to do.
Well, believe it or not, we've come to the end of our time. I don't know about you, but I feel better about what's happening on the Hill, knowing that people like Lily are there trying to make a difference.
Nice.
So it's a hard, there are many disadvantages about being older than I am, but one advantage of it is I have seen, this is a bad cycle, I'm not kidding you, for public health, but there are times when it's harder and there's times when this is a hard time, but it almost always leads to some different future. And last night, I think, gave some hope that the voters, at least in some places, didn't like some of what's happening. So what that turns into, we'll find out. But more importantly, I'd like to ask everybody and join me a round of applause for our guests.